Welcome back from the break. I'm Aya Johnson. And earlier we discussed about the fight against Ebola in Liberia. But we'll now be moving on to review on the news. To discuss these in the studio, I have our usual Adama Munu, our reporter. Adama, how has it been this whole week?
Hi there. It's been a really eventful week, particularly, obviously internationally. I think one of the biggest stories that has definitely caught our attention in the media has been the Greek crisis, which has been, I would say, one of the greatest crises in Europe. And so therefore we have our first article, which is from CNBC Africa. And it actually looks at, very briefly, the Greek crisis from an African perspective. So we know that the situation right now, we know the situation in Greece is very, very dire. There have been reports to say that essential supplies, food and medicine will run out in a number of days, and that the banks in Greece are down to their last 500 million euros, which is actually quite small, although it might seem very phenomenal. And Greek citizens can only now take out 50 euros from ATM machines, and that equates to about £35.50 over here in the UK. So this particular article was actually written on Tuesday, and it looks at the people that would benefit, actually, if you know, for want of a better word, to benefit from this particular situation. And it looks at Africa as well as America, and saying that this is actually a great time for Africa to have sort of investors going over there and utilising the situation.
But Adama, how is it possible for the United States and Africa combined to be making money benefiting from the Greek crisis?
Well, America will actually be the biggest beneficiary of the Greek crisis. And it's a very sad way and a very terrible way of putting it, but they would actually benefit monetarily because the dollar will be strengthened, which means, in comparison to the euro, that the prices for particular commodities would be low. And this is also helped by greater consumption and the lowering of oil prices. And the reason why Africa would benefit from this is because it's actually linked to the dollar as well, and that's an indirect consequence as well. So it's linked to the dollar, which will be strong. So it will be an opportunity for people to look for safe haven investments. However, I think it's really important to remember that there is a lot of parallels between what is happening in Greece and what has happened in Africa before. There was an article written by somebody called Christina Okella from RFI, which is a French online news website. And she said that this situation is a painful reminder of Africa's agony with the IMF, because back in the 80s and 90s, we had structural adjustment programs that they tried to relay onto developing countries in the continent that was needed to repay their debts. But actually, it actually hindered growth, and that's what a lot of economists say. So whilst there might be benefits for people who are looking to invest in Africa at this point in time, it is something which kind of runs synonymous with what's happened in Africa within the last couple of decades.
What about our second set of questions from the story concerning Facebook, I believe?
Yes, so we have a story from IT News Africa, and it looks at something that's happened this week, whereby Facebook, which is a huge social media giant, has actually opened its first office, or rather I'd say advertisement bureau in Africa, and they've opened it in Johannesburg in South Africa.
Should we not be happy that we've got a Facebook on the African continent, a footprint? Who's going to benefit? Is it Facebook or smaller businesses going to make an opportunity here?
Well, the reason why they're actually opening an advertisement bureau in Johannesburg is because they want to look at how they could support, they could actually kind of construct an advertising business model in Africa, because currently what's actually happening is that we have a lot of people in Africa who use Facebook. It's actually grown to 20% since last year, which means that we actually have 120 million more people in Africa who are utilising Facebook. But what the issue actually is that they're not able to utilise mobile advertisements online as a result of poor connectivity, issues to do with data usage as well. So I think Facebook are trying to utilize this part of the world and kind of forward their advantages in terms of the way that they use Facebook.
Well, I hope Facebook's not going to exploit Africans, and I hope Africans will benefit. What's your next story?
So the next story is from the Mail Guardian, which is a quite interesting article which looks at a Twitter trend that happened this week. The Africa the media never shows you in pictures. So as you know, Ayo, of course, Africa tends to bring to people's minds disaster and dire situations and starvation. We have a very negative picture of Africa. So this Twitter hashtag campaign was created to kind of give people a feel about what is really beautiful about Africa. One of my favourite ones, which unfortunately we're not able to put up, is a picture of a church and a mosque which has actually been constructed next to each other in Eritrea. And this gives the idea that, of course, Africa has always been a place where, you know, people from different religions and different backgrounds have been able to coexist together.
So this is like a liberalised continent moving at pace to bring about change through pictures and positive news.
Yes, they showed savvy beaches, university campuses, the fact that people don't all live in huts. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but just to show that there is so much more to what we know about Africa. And I think that's a really positive step towards trying to change that mentality.
What's the next article we got?
So the next article, unfortunately, isn't so positive, but it's a very important article from the New York Times, and it talks about Angolese oil and its impact on children. So a journalist was in Angola, and he created a video report looking at rural areas in Angola, and what he saw was a lot of devastation in rural villages, whereby children were not able to have access to medicine. However, Angola has struck very big with oil. Even the daughter of the president is, you know, a billionaire. So it's looking at those kind of disparities, and I think that's what the article is really about. Disparity.
Well, joining us on the line, we have Celeste Hicks, who is a former BBC correspondent and the author of the book, Africa New Oil. Celeste, do you have my voice?
Hi. Yes,
hello. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us at Africa This Week. Celeste, can you sort of tell me, is this yet another situation where an African government has failed, or is this that those who are claiming the oil, the multinationals, do they share a bit of responsibilities for some of the awful pictures that we see coming out of that part of the world?
I think it's a very typical story for an African oil producer that the country has earned many billions of dollars in revenue for their oil, but hasn't seen a massive development, education and health services. That's quite typical for African oil producers. They earn amazing amounts of money, but often you don't see any development happening. The reasons for that are incredibly complex, but are all to do with corruption and bad planning, lack of good governance to follow what's happened to the money when the African countries have earned it. You could ask whether it was the responsibility of the oil companies to help to promote development, but in the research that I've done for my book, in all the countries I profiled, the oil companies that I spoke to generally didn't feel that it was their responsibility. They're commercial operations, and they basically feel that their job is to get the oil out of the ground and sell it, and then questions of development and what happens with the money afterwards are not really their concern.
But Celeste, but then there's got to be somehow to bring multinationals that earn hundreds of millions from African countries, including Angola, to account. How does anyone put pressure to ensure that corporate social responsibility is adhered to?
Well, a lot of the oil companies that you're talking about do actually pay taxes. They pay royalties and taxes to the government, and they would feel that if they've struck a contract with the government to allow them to extract the natural resources, then it's not their responsibility what the level of taxation that the government sets is and how the government then uses that money. A lot of pressure has been put on oil companies to try and improve their image in Africa, and some of the smaller oil companies like Tullow Oil from the UK have tried to improve their image and to take issues like corporate social responsibility more seriously. But generally speaking, it's not. The oil companies, of course, don't want to pay more tax than they have to. They're commercial operations, so they would say that if the government doesn't ask for a very high level of taxation, that's not their fault.
Well, do you think that naming and shaming of some of these oil multinational companies on the basis that some of these countries that they do operate in are very impoverished, be it their fault or that of the governments themselves that govern the people. Do you think a name and shame campaign may be useful?
I think that a lot of progress has been made in terms of transparency in the oil industry. So a lot of the bad contracts and corruption that used to happen is now more public than it used to be. And I think, again, some of the oil companies are starting to take that more seriously and realise that they have to improve their image in Africa. But there's still a long way to go. It's very important that civil society and local politicians, opposition groups, and ordinary people, media and civil society all engage to find out what's happening in the oil industry and to bring pressure onto their government.
And the oil sector as a whole, do you think that there's been change over the last 10 years, or are we still back to where we were in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where it was a free-for-all?
I think there has been a lot of progress in the last 10 years. In the countries that I profiled for my book, which were Ghana, Chad, Niger, Kenya and Uganda, all of those countries were having a debate about how to make the oil money work for the benefit of the population. They were all discussing issues such as transparency, publishing contracts, putting money towards development, creating jobs and local opportunities. That kind of discussion just didn't happen at all in the 50s and 60s and 70s, as you were saying. Places like Nigeria, there was no public discussion between the media, the civil society and politicians about what the objectives of the oil project were. That's now commonplace in all of these countries that I've been talking about. They're all having that debate. So yes, a lot of progress has been made, but there's still a long way.
Celeste, I'm sorry to interject there, but a lot of effort's been made, but debating, is that truly going to help on the ground, just talking about it and not physically doing active things that people can physically see and touch? I mean, how do we bridge this gap?
Well, what you need is questions of where the money's being spent. So looking at tracing accountability for financial transactions, looking at spending plans for the government and making sure that the government, if it says it's going to spend money on something, making sure that it spends money on it. This is all to do with civil society monitoring and accountability initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which tries to find out where the money's been spent, how much has been earned, and whether the money's been spent on what it was intended to be spent on. They're practical steps that you can take.
Well, the murky world of the financial world, not to mention that of the oil sector. Well, that's it for this segment. Very interesting selection of articles indeed. And I want to thank Celeste Hicks for joining us. We'll be taking our last break of the show. When we come back, we'll be looking at Uganda and the Muslim community. We'll see you in 3.